We're back with the CHARA Project. I'm Heather.
I'm Sarah.
And today we're studying the concept that's repeated in James 2, where we see him say, faith without works is dead. We're going to use our CHARA Bible Study Guide as a way for us to unpack this. We want to understand the context around the passage, look at some history, understand who the author is, maybe do a little digging and research with different Bible translations and word meanings, and then we'll apply the Bible passage to our lives. You know, you can download this Bible study guide, a CHARA Bible Study Guide, right off of our website. We have a ton of resources there to help you learn how to study the Bible, as well as a study guide specifically geared into these verses that you can use as you're studying this passage on your own or in a group. And so this is a verse, you know, these concept of faith without works is dead is something that a lot of people will point to because they'll see that it may feel like it's contradicting other places in the Bible that talk about faith. And so I'm wondering if you've heard that same thing, Sarah.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, let's go there right away, I guess, right?
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped that bomb.
No, it does. And here's why we hear that. James says here in James 2 that faith without works is dead. And we see Paul saying in a couple of his letters, really, one of them in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, which is a podcast that we have done before, so make sure you check that out. Yeah. But that verse says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and it's not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Again, he says that something similar in Romans 3:20, "For no one will be justified," which means saved, in his sight by the works of the law, as well as in several places in Romans. So I think the question kind of here is Paul contradicting James, right? I mean, Paul says that you were saved by faith, not by works, and James says faith without works is dead. Right. So is the Bible contradicting itself? And I mean, the quick answer is no. That is one of our key principles under context here is that the Bible can't, your interpretation of of a passage in the Bible cannot conflict with something that is clearly taught somewhere else. So the Bible cannot contradict itself. That comes from the idea that the Bible is God's word, and God doesn't change his mind. God doesn't lie, and so we wouldn't expect his word to contradict itself either. But we don't want to just tell you that; we actually want to show you. So let's dive in, and let's look at what James is saying here. And the underlying question, I think, really, whether we're talking about Paul or James, it has to do with this concept of works, really, and its relationship to our salvation. But to be clear, both Paul and James, even in the passages I just mentioned in the surrounding context, they both state that faith is essential to salvation, but it's the role of works that there seems to be some difference there or potential difference. So what are we talking about? So when we read James in isolation, I think the question kind of boils down to, are works required for salvation? Okay. And before we can answer that, we need to probably define a few terms. Yeah. Probably what are works, right? So let's put a pin in that one. We're going to get to that one. And then also, what is salvation? And so when we get to context, we're going to spend quite a bit of time in context in James today. And when we do that, we're going to see this word justified used really interchangeably with the word saved or salvation.
And all of those words are really talking about your right standing with God. When it talks about when we talk about being saved at the end of this life, are we going to be able to be in the presence of God? Are we justified based on our sin? Have we been saved because of our sin to be in right standing with God and be in the presence of God at the end of time? And so this word salvation, justified or saved, it truly is interchangeable. But what about work, Sarah? Like, how are you going to define this one? Or am I taking the pin out too early?
No, that was great. And I love that clarification on the definition of salvation. So that was perfect.
Cool.
When it comes to works, one way we actually can kind of look at a definition, especially I like to use this method. We're going to look at different Bible translations. And sometimes I like to do that when our question is really kind of centering around one word. I would ask myself, gosh, are there any translations that might have, translated that particular word a little bit differently that might help us understand what was trying to be communicated? So we're going to look at Bible translations, and we're also going to spend a lot of time in context today to answer, really, to get more clarity here. But first, under research, under the CHARA Bible Study Guide, one of the things we do is we look at different Bible translations for a kind of a renewed perspective. So we did that, and we're going to read James 2:17, and to look at specifically this word works. Now, if you look at the King James Version or the ESV, the Christian Standard Bible, they all use the word works. So it says something along these lines. Faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself. But now if I turn to the NIV, which I believe is what you're reading out of, right, Heather?
Yep.
It says faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead.
Yep.
So instead of works, it uses the word action. That's kind of helpful there. And the New Living Translation, which is even more of a kind of a thought for thought, trying to communicate what the original thought was. It says faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. It is dead and useless.
So when James was referring to this concept of work, he's actually talking about good deeds or actions, like serving others. Is what I'm getting at, or what I hear in these different translations. He's not talking about works of the law, though, like what you talked about in Romans 3 when you were referencing something from Paul above. The person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. That's not what we're talking about. This is actual good deeds, actions, service.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it is something different, and we will see that as we get into context. Well, that'll become even clearer.
Okay,
but that's a
cool.
good shout out there. So what these translations are helping us kind of see that there is a relationship between faith and works, and these or good deeds or actions, right? And that really, if there is no relationship, if these don't coexist, your faith is dead. And the New Living Translation kind of clarified. It says, or useless. I love that word. It's like useless. And again, as we get into context, you're going to see this play out. But I wanted to take this first step with looking at translations just to simply show you how much they can really be helpful.
They were so helpful. Yeah.
Sometimes when you just have a question on one verse or one word, it really can be a helpful place to start. But all right, let's hang out in context now.
Okay.
We're going to be here for a minute. And we're going to be looking at immediate context. By context, we're talking about the text surrounding the verse.
Okay, and we were in verse 2:17, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so where are you going to bring us?
I'm going to go back to verse 14, which is really kind of where when you look at context, you want to look for an idea, a complete idea or a complete thought. And it really seems to start in about James 2:14. All right, so I'm going to read this. It says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can such faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothes and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, stay warm, and be well fed,' but you don't give them what the body needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself."
You know, shout out to the author here. One of the things we like to ask when we're looking at an author and how they write is what kind of figurative language or speech are they using? And one of them is rhetorical questions. And we see James use this rhetorical question. What good is it? But there's really no answer needed. It's so obvious that what the answer really is. But honestly, hospitality was such a huge part of their culture. You know, of course you take care of your brother in need. Like this was a complete rhetorical, but I just love his little sassy attitude that comes out. Like, what good is that?
Right? It's kind of, a rhetorical question. That's absolutely what that is. And not only was hospitality something that was very much the norm and an expectation in their culture, taking care of the needs of the poor was part of what God commanded them to do that back in Deuteronomy 15. I mean, that was something they were expected to do. And when it says when he simply says, "Go in peace," that is actually a Jewish farewell blessing. And it kind of makes me think of us today, you know, hearing that someone is in need, hungry or cold or whatever. And we're like, "I wish you the best. Good luck with that." You know, and so like there's a clear expectation in their culture. And I think this makes sense to us
it completely
today,
makes sense.
that we should help someone we should help someone in need.
Yes.
Especially those of us who have faith in God. You should have mercy towards people in need. So before I continue reading here, I just want to point out that so far we read verses 14 through 17.
Yep.
And James has painted a scenario here where faith was prioritized over works, right? That this idea that really works was kind of downplayed, you know, like you go on, be well, right? Instead of taking care of their needs. We're about to see that scenario is flipped, and James is going to examine an opposite situation here. To do this, James actually uses another figurative language kind of form of speech here. And this time he introduces this imaginary opponent. by saying, someone will say. So James is actually offering a counter, kind of an imaginary counter to what he just said here. And in verse 18, it says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works and I will show you faith by my works. And I really wrestled with this, with verse 18, trying to understand the reasoning, the logic, the argument that James is making here. And I really struggled with it. It wasn't,
Really?
yeah, it wasn't very clear to me. And like, it didn't seem to line up. And actually, I came to realize that it's not really clear whether the whole verse is part of the opponent's argument or just the first half. Let me explain here. So in verse 18, many of our modern translations, including the CSB, I think the NIV.
I have the NIV.
I think a lot of the more modern translations or recent translations in verse 18 says, but someone who will say, quote, you have faith and I have works, end quote. And then it goes on. And that's really the counter argument. But the NASB actually says, but someone will say, quote, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works and I will show you my faith by my works.
So it's not like
End quote.
it's not adding in more words. It's just moving the quotation mark of what's being quoted.
Yeah, it actually helped me because it's the counter argument that James is bringing up. And then it goes into James's response. And so it actually helped it make more sense to me. And in this case, when you include the full quote, the opponent, the opponent is throwing down a challenge.
Yeah.
Here, and he says, show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works.
Well, and I think this is great because, I love that you're pointing out these quotation marks moving from translation to translation because there were no quotation marks in the original Greek language. So this would make sense that maybe we don't really understand exactly what's being quoted here. And boy, does it has way more clarity on pulling those quotation marks to the end of the actual thought.
I don't know that I've ever come across a passage in the Bible where the quotation marks were confusing to me or stood out to me.
No, but again, all added afterwards, so we're kind of assuming where it's supposed to be.
But it didn't come to mind at first, and so I like I said, maybe this all made perfect sense to all of you, but I struggled with this one.
And it's just a good reminder of looking at different Bible translations not only has the power from a word perspective, but obviously we're trying to figure out exactly what's being quoted, or the Bible translators were trying to figure out what was being quoted, and it makes way more sense by moving it.
I think so. And actually, the a resource that I looked at under the CHARA Guide, under research, sometimes when we get confused on a passage or stuck like I did, we might want to go to commentaries.
Yes.
And that's what I did. And I went to the Bible Knowledge Commentary amongst a couple others. But the Bible Knowledge Commentary by Walvard and Zuck, if I pronounce their names correctly, they suggest that verse 19 actually could also be included as part of, within those quotes, within the opponent's counter challenge here. So let me read verse 19. You may have heard this before. It says, you believe that God is one. Good. Even the demons believe and they shudder. So what's his point here? He's downplaying faith and he's prioritizing works. The opposite of verses 14 through 17.
Yeah.
If this was still the opponent's challenge, as the Bible Knowledge Commentary suggests, it could be that this is a Gentile believer challenging a Jewish believer, the Jewish believers, that their belief that God is one, challenging that, hey, that belief alone is not enough.
Well, and shout out to history here, because if the oneness of God actually points to the Shema. It's in Deuteronomy 6:4, and it was be recited daily by the Jewish people. And it says, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is something that was just part of their daily practice of how they talked and this was something ingrained into who they were, and very much who would be the audience of James.
Yeah, and because of that, they may have felt like, hey, that belief alone is enough. And so this opponent, if that's the case, this opponent may be saying, hey, yeah, you do have correct theological doctrine. That is, God is one. Yes, that's correct. But that alone isn't enough. Even the demons know that God is one, and they shudder.
Yeah.
So even the demons understand God is one.
It's a big deal.
And it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the demons aren't saved. Okay. So like, here's that juxtaposition. Like, okay, the demons have this knowledge, but they're not saved. So why is this knowledge not enough here? Because they know of God, but they haven't placed their trust in God.
Oh, that's a good clarification.
Yeah, so I don't want to get caught in the weeds here over, like verses 18 and 19 and what was part of, this counter argument versus James' response. But it did help make sense to me. Put these two verses,
Right.
It helped them make sense to me. Simply put, if I could just simplify it here, here's what I'm seeing. James started in verse 14 through 17 with someone who neglected his brother's needs, right?
Right.
And so he prioritized faith and he downplayed works. Mm-hmm. Now, this counter argument that James brings up in verses 18 and 19, this opposing argument, he prioritized works and downplayed faith.
Yeah.
And so the opponent swings too far the opposite direction. And I think James, he's not trying to be pro-works, anti-faith, or pro-faith, anti-works. He's neither, talking about flimsy faith or empty works. He's neither one of those is sufficient.
Okay, but so then what's James' point?
I'm glad you asked.
I'm like, please make sure, I hope that's what you're going to get to.
Well, I think he's setting the stage. Hey, guys, it's not either or. It's not this one's more important than this one. Let's keep reading.
Okay.
Let's keep reading.
We're still in context then.
We're still in context,
All right.
yes, with just a little added commentary on the side.
Mm-hmm.
Starting back up in verse 20. Senseless person. This is where I think James is responding to this counter argument. Senseless person, which I think yours says something else. Right?
My translation NIV says, "You foolish man."
Yes. And I'm reading out of the CSB. All right. You foolish man, or you senseless person, are you willing to learn that faith without works is useless? Wasn't Abraham our father justified by works in offering Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was active together with his works, and by works faith was made complete. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. That's beautiful.
Oh, so good.
You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. All right, so there's 2 points that there's a lot we could talk about in there. There's 2 points that I want to pull out today. One is in verse 22. It says, you see that faith was active together with his works, and by works, faith was made complete. Again, you see that relationship, and by works, your faith was made complete.
I like this because I was reading the James 2:17 in different Bible translations earlier, and the Amplified version actually reiterates this concept a little bit. It says, faith, if it does not have works to back it up, is by itself dead, inoperative, and ineffective. It's like, hey, you have to have this. It needs to back it up. It needs to actually have some kind of connection there.
Yeah.
So
otherwise, your faith is dead. It's useless.
It's ineffective.
It's ineffective.
Yeah.
Oh, that's ineffective.
A great
I
word.
love the Amplified for that. Tell us a little bit about the Amplified Bible, Heather.
It's the most quirky Bible. You should not use it for devotional reading because it has a lot of parenthetical phrases behind stuff. But what it's trying to do is, if a Greek word has more than one English word tied to it, it will put those words behind a word just to kind of help you understand what is it that this verse is trying to get across. And so it's really quite helpful if you're trying to understand from a word perspective, or what is the verse trying to say. Horrible for devotional reading, but great for Bible study.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the first thing we saw in that section that I read there in this last part in James really is that there's that faith and works are active together. He's talking about faith that translates into action.
Yeah,
right.
I like that.
And the second thing I want to pull out from what I had just read was he gives 2 examples. He gives the example of Abraham and Rahab. And we can use cross references in our, those little tiny, little numbers
In the middle of the study Bible?
In the middle. Sometimes it's at the bottom. Ours are both in the middle here. They can tell you where in history, where back in the Bible you can go read about these people and what their story was. I'm not going to go into both of them, which would be fun, but just to save time, let's talk about Abraham for just a second. Okay. So in Genesis 15, God had promised Abraham in his old age that he was going to have a son, that he would have an heir. And it says in Genesis 15:6, and James quotes this, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So his belief in God credited him as righteous.
Right.
Justified.
Just the faith alone.
Yep. Righteous, justified, saved, all triangulating around the same word here. So that was Genesis 15. And later in Genesis 22, Abraham acts on that faith. And that's what James is pulling out here. He's acting on that faith when he offered his promised son, Isaac, on the altar.
That's right.
And one of my cross references pointed to Hebrews 11:17 here. And I think this is worth reading. This is
good
in
Bible context.
Yeah. It lands in the Faith Hall of Fame chapter, Hebrews 11, if you've ever heard of that. But let me read Hebrews 11:17 through 19. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, your offspring will be traced through Isaac. He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Therefore, he received him back, figuratively speaking. So what I love about that is you see Abraham trusts in God's promise. When it says he considered God able to even raise someone from the dead, Abraham trusted one in God's promises, and he trusted in God's character. Hey, this is the son that you promised me, and if he dies, you can raise him up again. Yeah. And so you see his faith in a very powerful way, acting out because he trusts God.
Well, no, and this is cool because shout out to research. One of the questions we have under research is what does the word meaning mean? And if you look up the word faith or that's being used here, it's pistis, which the other way that pistis is often translated is meaning to trust. And so we see that Abraham is absolutely trusting and putting his trust in God, and that is all through action. It's the action of what Abraham is doing that we're seeing his faith come to life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cool. So cool.
No, that's great. And so James has already introduced this idea of faith leading to action, action based on trust. I love that. So now let's go to book context and ask ourselves, really, do we see this anywhere else in the book of James? And we do. Back in James chapter 1, verses 22 through 25, it says, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like someone looking at his own face in a mirror. For he looks at himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres in it and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer who works, this person will be blessed in what he does. So James says here, be doers of the word, right, and not hearers only. In other words, I think live out your faith, right? Like good works, really they follow a saving faith. They're fruit or evidence that you have a genuine saving faith in Jesus. There's actually a quote here that I liked from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. I really liked that one. It says, works serve as a barometer of justification, or salvation, while faith is the basis for justification.
Oh, that's really good. So the question you started with was, are works required for salvation? And that doesn't seem to be really what James is saying here. So was his purpose to explain how one was saved? Like, what's going on here?
Well, that's a really good question. I think what we naturally would ask is what you're doing here is, what was the purpose of the author? Was he trying to explain how someone is saved? And the answer is no, he's not. No. James's purpose, and that's one of our author's questions, and you really want to keep that in mind as you read this. If the overall purpose wasn't to talk about how one is saved here, then maybe that shouldn't be our takeaway, right? But James's overall purpose to these early believers, I see is I read the book of James. That's how I think really the best way to kind of find an author's purpose is to just sit down and read the whole book.
Yes.
Gosh, I just saw him calling believers to maturity.
Yes.
Like, hey, live out your faith, grow up, guys. This is what it looks like in a couple of different scenarios. Well,
and the reality is, if you know who the book is written to, which was to the early Jewish believers. In fact, right in James 1:1, it says to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad. This is the Jewish Christians that were spread. And this was the earliest letter that we know of. It was written in the New Testament right after Jesus died. And so if we realize this is right after Jesus died, these are early Christians and they've been scattered everywhere, and they're needing some insightful insight on how to live their faith out because they've all been spread out everywhere. They're probably by themselves trying to figure out, how do I do this? Now that Jesus is gone, now that I'm called to go and live a life for him, what does that look like? James is obviously in this showing this is what it looks like to have faith. This is what it looks like to have maturity as a believer in Christ. And you almost, I also love it because it almost feels like a little Proverbs-esque in some of the ways that he, in the whole book, because he hops around to different topics that he knows that they're likely struggled with, but all of them are very much anchored in maturity in Christ and understanding what it looks like to be a believer.
I love that. And it kind of makes me ask, okay, so this was helping them, giving them instruction how to apply their faith to their life. Let's do that ourselves now.
Okay, let's apply it.
Yeah, let's apply what we've learned. And by doing so, let's actually revisit to that first question, or kind of the first concern that we saw, really that
the contradiction of
yeah.
Paul versus James. And
yeah. One of our questions in the CHARA guide under apply is a yield question. And it's it's referring, first of all, to recognize and acknowledge our assumptions and bias that we bring to the text. We did that up front there. Hey, some people point to this as saying, does the Bible contradict itself? Does James contradict Paul in this passage here? So let's revisit that just to make sure that we wrap that up and are being clear here, especially on this topic of works in salvation. Okay, so we've looked at context, right? Quite a bit of context in James. We've talked about the author's purpose. Yep. We've looked at like a history example with Abraham, and we've even researched different translations. So we've touched just about every one of our, we're applying. We've touched every single one of these 5 categories in the CHARA guide, and all of them seem to be defining really what James meant by faith without works is dead. And he wasn't telling them how to be saved. He wasn't, that wasn't his purpose.
Especially since they were already saved.
Right. Yeah. He was telling them how to live out their faith. In fact, I love, there's a quote here by Norman Geiser that I found in the Big Book of Bible Difficulties.
Great book.
Actually is a good book.
Yeah.
If you have questions on some specific passages like we do, kind of a good book to have. Anyways, this quote from Norman Geiser says, Paul is speaking about justification before God, which is by faith alone, whereas James is referring to justification before men who cannot see our faith, but only our works. That's actually a really good point.
Yeah.
Right? Other people can't see our faith. They can only see, like, the fruit is what they see. That's how they know that we're believers and that we follow Christ, is by the fruit.
Well, and here you have Paul and James. They're both going out. One is going to the circumcised or the Jews. One is going to the uncircumcised or the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And they were both had different purposes and different reasons in different talk tracks. So of course they're going to probably sound a little different. But here's what's fascinating. If you go to Galatians 2, you actually see Paul go in front of the council in Jerusalem. He's hanging out in front of James and a bunch of other disciples, and he preaches what he's been preaching on the road to ensure that what he was preaching was correct. And he gave them every opportunity to say, you're contradicting what we're saying. And they didn't. They gave him a pass. They were like, no, what you're saying is very much in line with what we are preaching and what we are teaching in our ministry. And so I love it that not only are we seeing that they actually complement each other, they're just two different sides of the same coin. Yeah. But what we're seeing also is that in the Bible backs it up, that James got a chance to hear what Paul was saying and had no problem with it being focused on the idea that we are saved by grace alone.
Yeah.
By faith. Yeah.
No, that is so helpful. I love that. And just again, a shout out to, I know we didn't go into great depth into, some
Ephesians,
of Paul's points that he makes. But we do have that podcast on Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 for you're saved by grace through faith, not by works. That passage. If you want to know more about what the purpose was there and what he was communicating, please go listen to that podcast. Yeah. But the second part of this question, this yield question, okay, we've identified our bias and our assumptions that we brought to this. Is this contradicting? Okay, hopefully we're walking away going, well, no, it's actually not. But so now what, right? What do we need to give up to be in harmony with the Bible is really the question we want to ask. What do we need to surrender?
Well, and I mean, isn't this about the idea that we actually need to be, if we have faith, we need to be women and men of action, Again, it goes back to that, and I feel like I say this a lot on this podcast, but it's like if you understand the love of God and it has flowed into you so deeply, your natural outpouring is going to be one of action and one where you're going to want to represent who Christ is. I think oftentimes of this faith and works concept very much in the same way of how do we show love, right? Like if I say I love my husband, am I just going to say it, or am I actually going to have action that comes with it? And doing everything that it does to be able to have a healthy marriage. That is something that is, I show my love by the action. They're not required of each other. They are separate pieces, but it is two sides of the same coin. Same thing with faith and works. I show my faith because of how my outpouring of who Christ is in me. It's going to naturally flow out.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's a beautiful illustration. And I think truly, if we were falling into the original argument that, hey, I've got faith, I know about God, that's good enough. James is calling us on the table.
Oh
on that
yeah,
one.
it's very
Like,
pointed,
right?
Pointed, yeah.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. And the opposite too. I mean, just the counter argument that like these empty works, that doesn't save either. Clearly, that's what Paul is shouting so clearly. Yeah. So we need to surrender to be in line with what we're learning here in the Bible. Another applied question that we love is to ask, what do you learn about God? And I think there's some powerful takeaways here. One being that God cares how we treat people.
Oh, yeah.
He cares how we treat others, and he wants us to be merciful towards others. He also cares about how we behave. And we didn't go a lot into great detail on that, but James talks about that as well, like our language, our speech. And so God cares how we treat others, and he cares about our behavior.
Yeah, that seems like a fair point. And honestly, shouldn't we, I think it says somewhere in the Bible, they will know us by our love.
Yeah.
They will know us by our love. So if we truly are Christ followers, isn't our natural outflowing going to be one that is going to show love to others in everything that we do? And so that would come out of action. That, of course, would be a part of works, not because we have to, but because we get to, because that's part of being a follower of Christ, is your natural desire is to want to show others love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe to wrap it up, I would say let's end with prayer. And really asking the Lord the question, what I learned about you, how do I apply this to my life?
Good. That's good.
Because this passage in James isn't as much talking about our relationship with God as it is talking about our horizontal relationship with others and how we live out our faith. This prayer should be prayed daily. I think, okay, Lord, how do I live out my faith today? How do I serve this person? How do I love this person in need? What does it look like today?
Yes, and not even say daily, I'd say hourly sometimes, depending on if you're in a traffic jam.
For sure.
Yes, I would definitely be praying. But it's a great point, Sarah, and you brought so much clarity to this passage for us, because this is not an easy one. This is one we could look at easily and be like, I don't understand how this works and how it aligns with the rest of the Bible. So I'm so grateful that you were willing to dive in deep and struggle yourself in order to get to a spot where you can help us understand that relationship between faith and works. If you're interested in learning more on how to study the Bible, we hope that you go on our website. You can not only download the CHARA Bible Study Guide, we have a ton of resources out there specifically for you. We also would love for you to like, subscribe, and comment for this podcast, because that really helps us out. And join us next time as we will be hanging out, doing another Bible passage and learning how to study the Bible together as we continue to dive into God's Word. We thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.